I do hope you'll join us for that. A couple other events that are coming up that I wanted to share with you. So business ethics and real world violations is on June 2nd from noon to 2 p.m. If you are looking for those hard to find business ethics CPEs, this is the spot for you. Hope you'll join us for that. And then June 21st, 2021 is our annual golf outing. It is the first day of summer. I just made that connection thanks to our speakers here this morning. So join us for the first day of summer and out on the course. And you can find more information for that and all of the upcoming events at feitwincities.com. Our last event I want to highlight is our annual meeting. That will be on July 14th from noon to 1, and that is a virtual meeting. And now I'm going to introduce our moderator for today's session. That is Jay Trumbauer. Jay is COO and CFO of Boulay. He's also a key player in putting together this M&A series. Jay.
Thanks, Roseanne. Welcome, everybody. This has been long in the making. This session, we looked forward to this session 2 years ago. We were going to meet in person. It was all set up. And we had this little thing called COVID come around. So we are very excited to bring this to everybody today. I also wanted to point out we are looking at a deal makers panel sometime this fall. So that would be a fifth kind of add-on to this series. We're waiting to do that in person rather than virtually. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dave Rust, fellow board member of FEI with me.
Morning, everybody. I'm Dave Rust. I'm the CFO at Salo. We're excited to share some great content this morning on this interesting and important topic of people and culture in M&A. We are also excited to showcase two great examples of the talent that Salo works with in Jackie Punch and David Kuhl. Salo is in the people business, and we are focused on building a world that works better together. We put people first in everything we do because we believe when people are empowered and inspired, amazing things can happen. Obstacles are overcome, innovation ignites, and business thrives. Salo's business is to connect vetted experts in finance, accounting, and HR with organizations who need their expertise. These connections propel both experts and the organizations forward. Our experts get careers that are flexible and fulfilling, and they get that simultaneously. Organizations get the confidence and capacity to turn possibility into progress. Many of you have known Salo for some time and know our origins as a Minneapolis-based firm that later expanded into Chicago. Like just about everybody else on this call, COVID has certainly provided many challenges for us over the past year and a half or year plus. But one of the many bright spots has been how it's accelerated a shift to virtual and remote work, which has expanded our capabilities and our horizons greatly. Today, our talent is working from anywhere as we've expanded to serve clients and candidates across the U.S. Our nationwide network ensures our clients get the best resource in the country, while our talent experts get the opportunity to work with companies from coast to coast, remotely or in person. And it's a meaningful experience all around. We are a proud sponsor of FEI in both Minneapolis and Chicago, and we think that FEI is the best place to connect with financial leaders while also learning through great content such as this M&A series and today's discussion. With that, I'll turn it back over to Jay to get us started with a polling question.
Hey, thanks, Dave. Appreciate it. Here's our first polling question. Gives us a sense of what your involvement has been in the M&A process. What areas of the M&A process have you been involved in? And check as many as possible. As you can see, I won't go into the details here. I'll leave it up to your imagination where you might fit in, but please check any and all that you've been involved with. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. I'll give our folks just a few more seconds because there are a lot of choices on here. We have 25 folks taking the polls, so I'll give you just a few more seconds.
I almost forgot to do it myself, Nancy.
Not to worry, Jay, I'll get you. All right, I'm going to end that poll and share the results to let us know.
Oh, very good, very good. 38% they're finding a buyer. As expected, deal analysis, due diligence, negotiation, closing, post-closing integration you'd expect from this audience, I believe. So Jackie and David, that gives you some sense of what the audience is like today. With that, I'll hand it over to Jackie and David.
Thank you, Jay. We're just going to do a quick introduction. Good morning. I'm Jackie Punch. It's a pleasure to be here. I am currently a senior HR consultant and executive coach, so I work with clients through Salo. I've had the privilege before that of being the head of HR in 3 organizations. This is the Twin Cities chapter, so probably the biggest one I've been involved in was when Target put Marshall Fields up for sale and sold it for $3.2 billion to May Corporation. But I've also been involved in many smaller mergers and acquisitions as well.
All right. Well, first of all, I'm just so excited to have this conversation. The bulk of our presentations are to HR, and there's nothing wrong with HR, but to talk to finance that has this depth of knowledge is really fun. So I'm expecting and hoping we're going to get some good questions. But Dave mentioned Salo, and just as a kind of a precursor, I was a customer of Salo, not once, twice, but 3 times at 3 different companies. And I fell in love with their culture and the people I interfaced with. After I semi-retired, I couldn't resist joining Salo. So I've been there for 6 months. I'm in charge of the executive search function. We've placed over 1,000 CFOs, CHROs over the last decade. I don't want to say we're a well-kept secret, but we are a powerhouse in placing executive talent in finance and HR in the Midwest, and have a national brand campaign that's going to launch here shortly. That's even more exciting. But also in charge of a new line of business called CEO Advisory and Board Advisory. And we'll talk a little bit about it, but it's super exciting because as a buyer of services, I got tired of paying the big firms a lot of money to give you, good advice, but it was, tended to be brought with an army of people that created sort of a dependency on these big firms. And that's really the anti-model that we are creating, and super excited to go to the market with this new offering to help boards, help CEOs at the very highest level of strategy, profitability, culture, talent, some of the things we're going to talk about today. So just quick bio, I started my career as a corporate attorney, and I worked in San Francisco for a law firm out there, primarily doing employment law, but also did a lot of deal work, and then moved to a firm in Minneapolis and did a similar job, then went in-house with United Health Group. I often tell people that I was typically the least popular person at cocktail parties, because not only was I an HR lawyer, but I worked for the largest HMO in the country. So that's the limit of my humor today. So, but in all jokes aside, it really was a great experience because we got to do, dozens of deals, large deals, Pacific Care, Mamsie, Golden Rule, Sierra Health, and really learned a lot, not just about world-class acquisition, but my own journey in terms of starting as the lawyer, working on T's and C's and benefit plans and equity programs and severance employment agreements. It became very obvious to me midstream that culture, people, talent was underrated and so critical to the success of the deals that I personally worked on. So it's a position that I come at from some experience, but also just passion, because I now know and believe in my heart that this is an area that is so underappreciated, and particularly coming out of COVID, companies that don't put a spotlight on culture and people and talent are really missing a lot of value creation. And it's funny because as I was looking at the title this morning, I was like, we didn't name this thing the right thing because it isn't really beyond the numbers. It is the numbers. It's about the numbers. It's about creating success and value, and so much of what I'm passionate about and Jackie has experienced is just trying to figure out a way, high empathy ways to get people from, being acquired all the way through post-integration and having a successful career, hopefully with the target company. So I've been done deals, private sector, public sector, and, people are people. And as we go through this conversation, the reality is that, most of the deals are very similar. You're talking about someone that's probably scared about having a job, about who they're going to report to, about what their job really looks like. And the goal is to build them up, sort of into a place where they feel secure, psychologically safe, and then really building an opportunity and a path gets them super excited. And some deals you can't do that, but if you have the ability to get people the minds and hearts, it doesn't just create value, but it creates culture. It creates a lot of goodness that comes out of that. So that's my front end commercial. And I think we're going to go to a polling question. So Nancy.
Thank you very much. Next poll is up on your screen. What percentage of mergers, acquisitions fail to hit their financial goals? If you were paying attention.
You're leading the witnesses.
Sorry. Okay, I have a couple more poll takers. If you're not paying attention, we have a poll on the screen. One more poll taker, please. Okay, there you are. I'm going to end that poll and share those results. And there you have it.
60%. Yep. No one said 20%. That's probably good. And I think there's one more polling question. You want to just add that one on Nancy at this point?
And your next polling question is up on the screen. What percentage of executives rate the rigor of which they do their cultural due diligence on par or greater with financial due diligence? 15, 35, 55, 75%. Okay, two more poll takers. I got 19 out of 21 people. If you're not taking the poll, it's your answer now. All right, I'm gonna share those results. And there you have it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Pretty
Yeah, a
well.
little more dispersion there. So if we go back, and if I don't know, Jackie or Nancy, if you can go back to that first poll question, just a couple comments on that before we get into the Q&A. So the answer, so to speak, relative to a couple of different studies is 80%. It's usually, you see it's 70 to 90% of acquisitions actually fail to hit their financial targets, which, as you can imagine, is extraordinarily high. And the research tells us that more and more, one of the leading causes for the failure is cultural integration and moving your talent, from your acquired company to your target. So if you combine, the data sets, it's about 1 in 4 acquisitions fail because of a poor cultural integration. And again, from my experience, I think that's actually low. So we really want to talk about what it looks like, from a best practice perspective, some tools and frameworks as to how to do the due diligence all the way through post-integration in a way that, best preserves, value, but more importantly, gives people a great experience and gets them productive as soon as possible as they come through the acquisitions. We're primarily focused on acquisitions, not divestitures for obvious reasons, but the reality is that this is again, a huge area of opportunity for most acquisitions, particularly companies that don't have a large staff that, can do due diligence and can do the strategic HR, to pull people through. So we will go to Jay at this point for a question.
Well, thank you. And this has been very interesting. I thought those numbers, especially that last question where the numbers were spread out pretty evenly, gives you an idea of, what's happening out there to a certain extent. I would say some management teams value culture on the due diligence list. Other ones really think of it as kind of an afterthought. But David, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on the importance of culture in the acquisitions, and from your experience, some examples of what has gone well, what hasn't gone well.
Yeah.
And then a follow-up to that would be the tools and assessments used in the due diligence.
Yeah, so some of the classic, I guess I'll start with the wall of shame and be respectful of my prior employers. But if we look at the marketplace and look at acquisitions that most people say were not successful because of culture, people, talent, there's two that come to mind. I mean, one is Amazon and Whole Foods. So Amazon, everyone obviously knows, highly focused on efficiency, on logistics, process excellence, buys Whole Foods, which had an entirely different culture around customer centricity, around high value, high touch. And the cultural integration was basically, we're going to move toward the Amazon model. So efficiency, logistics, excellence, delivery times, all the things that Amazon is world class in. And it was a huge cultural mismatch. And the financial projections weren't even close to become hit because the morale went in the toilet, turnover went up, they lost key leaders left and right. And if they were honest, and most people have said that that was a really good example of how not to do it, because in most acquisitions that aren't a complete transformation, you have to figure out what's the best of the acquired company culture and try to preserve that and try to pull that through very intentionally. And companies that either decide you're going to come over, under the new culture, or don't even talk about it, are really, missing a huge opportunity. So that's a really good example. Second one is Google and Nest. Nest is the thermostat, company. Google, obviously known for world-class engineering. They're very bottoms-up culture. So they tend not to have too much top-down decision-making. And Apple, or Nest, which really was a spinoff of Apple, opposite, very top-down, very hierarchical, very directive. And again, $3.2 billion deal that went in the toilet, largely because there was no intentional effort to think about how do you marry these two cultures in a way that you come through where it's not going to be Nest, it's not going to be Google, but some, magical combination. And the reality is that, again, complete market failure. And a lot of that is attributed to the culture. And a lot of people, that kind of go into this whole conversation think that, there's a magic culture. Culture is so elusive, it's soft, and it's hard to even define what it is. But the more you talk about what the culture is, the more you understand the attributes of culture. And it isn't always coming from the leaders. The leaders will tell you usually a pretty rosy story. But when we do due diligence, we look hard at Glassdoor, at LinkedIn. We look at other sources of data that give you a sense of what it's really like to be there, not at the senior level, but further down in the organization. And as we have conversations, it's really trying to get the nuances that they don't necessarily want to advertise around, the micro turnover and the tenure and all the things that really impact, so your culture. So bringing that more specifically to the deals that I worked on, just 3 points I would make in terms of things to keep in mind. One is the basic blocking and tackling on benefits and comp, on 401k, on policies. You have to really do a nice job of truly understanding, not just what they have, but how important is it to the employees. And what's been interesting to me is that some companies rank, healthcare as the number one issue. In other companies, it's around their pet policy. And really understanding that value prop and how they weight those benefits and those basics is important, because again, people come into deals almost distrustful. Most people are more negative than positive. And putting yourself in their shoes to understand, how do they see their benefits? How do they see their policies? And, again, have a world-class checklist. I'm glad to give you mine if you want it, but the reality is to make sure you fully understand not just what they are, but how important is it to their employee value prop. So that'd be number one. Number two is, again, being very intentional about the culture. Depending on the type of deal, there's some deals that if it's a add-on or a consolidation deal, it's important, to really understand how much of that culture and that org structure and that talent are you pulling through? How much do you want to change and bring into the acquired company culture? And culture won't change in 3 months. It takes years. And it's amazing how many leaders think that, okay, this is how we operate, there's our policies, and all of a sudden, snap your fingers and they're part of the culture. Well, you go to the first town hall, and this has happened to me 3 times, where people show up in their old company logo. And that's a pretty good sign that they're not there. And that's actually one of the best metrics I've seen, is how many people, come to that first meeting wearing the new company logo. But in seriousness, it's being intentional about are you going to leave that culture as it is? Are you going to merge the two, or are you going to really, I don't call it steamroll, but are you going to bring them into the mothership like Google and Amazon did? And it's important to be transparent and authentic, and really understand kind of what the future state is for the culture. The last point I'll make, and again, this sounds so silly, but it's really putting yourself in the shoes of the individual that's coming over and being transparent and honest. And if it's a type of deal where people are going to lose their jobs, then that needs to be stated, and needs to be done obviously in a very fair approach. But that honesty and transparency builds trust. And in these situations, typically your turnover spikes up significantly unless you create trust, unless you create empathy and some very specific programs to get people up that, sort of change curve. So those are just a few things. There's a few more. And I guess I'll add one more. Swag, it sounds so silly, but swag is so important. The shirts, the cups, the branding, all the stuff that your marketing team, hopefully has, to get people that information, that swag before close, and get them excited about it. Like I say, it's just a little thing, but I've seen it play out really well. And where companies don't do a good job, they tend to lose opportunity. So just a few things.
Oh, thanks, Dave. Just want to go off script here a little bit. Additional question around culture, because it's so important. I'm curious, is part of a due diligence team a process? It's so easy to talk to executive members of the companies back and forth, and each one is trying to position themselves in a certain way. How do you go about in the diligence process, peeling the onion, so to speak? How are you able to get down deeper into the organization to understand truly from people what the culture is?
Yeah, Jackie, you want to take it?
Yeah, I will. I think it'll tie. I'm going to talk in a few minutes about talent mapping, but at a high level.
Okay.
I think, during due diligence, you spend a lot of time together. So putting the right people on those teams is really key. And I think, getting HR very involved up front, as well as, I don't think all the hiring decisions should be HR, but leaders, and actually putting the conversation on the table. The things that I've been involved with, it isn't always unnatural, because we're so busy with all the financial components and the legal risks and all of this. But especially as the deal goes on, you're still in due diligence, we have to insert that into the conversation. And I've found it impactful to share some of these stats or some of my own experiences. I'll give you one example. I joined a company once, and when they were recruiting me to be the leader of HR, they'd done a pretty significant acquisition that doubled the size of their company 4 years earlier. And when they hired me, they said, we need your help on integration, particularly around culture, because we didn't make it happen. So even being able to share some of the stats we've shared with you, or some of those stories, but inserting it into the process, planning for it, identifying some leaders to drive it is really key.
Yeah,
my experience has been on the sell side. When I'm on the sell side and there's a buyer, and a decent sized buyer typically will be pretty protective around who you can speak with within their company. And I always try to get a little deeper if I can get into, middle management, not really just to probe them more on the culture and what they believe the strengths are. If you can get in there a little deeper, I think my experience is you learn a lot more.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I like to ask awkward questions. So if I can get the survey data and it looks like there's a vulnerability in terms of culture, I want to really explore that. I also want to look Glassdoor and see, is there a rating under 3.0 and what are the themes? Because there's a lot of people can go out there and say whatever they want, but you start seeing themes around management, around benefits, then that's a good place to really, kind of push. Also looking at asking the questions around, why have the last, 5 or 6 people left this company? What was the reason they left the company? And what could the company do better to keep its top talent? And really probing. And if you're able to get to mid-level management, that's the gold mine, right? Because they don't have economic gain tied to this deal in most cases. And if you can get beyond sort of the sell of the CEO to people that are actually in the trenches, you can really learn a lot. And every culture, no matter what company you're talking about, is going to have opportunities to improve. what you're looking for is this, sort of really in the dip. Is it improving or is it something? Because the last deal I worked on at ACI, their culture was better than ours, no doubt. And so the question is, how do you pull that through in a way that you get the synergies between, the companies and not sort of, extinguish that. But, the tools and frameworks, if you can get a survey instrument that's been done, pre-acquisition, that's gold. Oftentimes they have that. And sometimes companies let you do a simple survey in the acquisition process, which is extremely helpful as well. But if you can't, then it's probing, it's finding, kind of vulnerabilities and really trying to get a sense of, is this going to be how big of a lift on a cultural perspective is it going to be?
Well, you may have already talked about it, but any war stories, any mistakes along the way that you've encountered that you would kind of caution folks on?
Yeah, I'd like to share a couple really quick ones. I mentioned Marshall Fields earlier, so I'm going to draw from that. Just picture this, you walk into your first big meeting, the deal has closed, and one side of the table was all men in suits and a couple of women, and the other side of the table was a whole bunch of women. And it was just, the cultures really didn't speak the same language. And so I think my example is how critically important it is to make sure you really know what you're talking about and you're speaking the same language. Companies use a lot of acronyms. Part of this was we had to do a whole bunch of systems conversions, and moving to the May company systems was pretty flawless, okay? But we had a big ticket system, for those of you who don't know retail, that's furniture. And it was a legacy system. The technology teams and IT, they seemed to be working really well together, but they didn't speak the same language, and it was a disaster. And we had very unhappy customers, and it was low productivity, we lost money, and it took us about a year to fix it. So it is really about, it's related to culture, but it's very focused on communication, and make sure you're really clear on what the needs are, what the goals are, what you literally are talking about. The second one is more of an idea, but it's a mistake we make. I worked in a company where we did a lot of small acquisitions. And in that company, they set up an integration office, which I would say was really smart and worked really well. But here was the mistake. Initially, it was set up, to be, there was an RVP. And so the new employees got to know all these people and all these processes, and then they moved into a region. So for an employee experience, it was terrible because they moved twice, there's turnover risks. Now the solve wasn't that hard. You can let people know this is the region you're moving into, let them have exposure to the new leadership and still have the nuts and bolts of the day-to-day on the integration. This is more process, but there's people components too, be held by that special team.
Yeah, those are great points. A couple just additional thoughts around mistakes I've made or teams I've worked with have made. One is really dialing in on how value is created on the deal. So is it a add-on deal where you're buying, assets or technology? Is it a consolidation? Is it a transformation deal that is really contingent on IP and innovation and growth, where that bringing the human, the culture and the talent and all that comes with that through in a very positive way is so critical. Culture is always important, but there are certain deals where it is one of the top, one or two issues, and you really have to dial that in intentionally on the front end, I would say. Second is, really around the future org and the capabilities that you need for that future org, not where you've been, where you're going, and having a really good process to determine, what skills you have, not just today, but what you're going to need going forward. So that talent mapping that, we'll talk a little bit about is really, really important. In most deals, people have complete role confusion. They have a job description, right? We all have a job description, but the reality is that job description doesn't reflect what they're doing or what they're going to do. So we had a deal many years ago where an executive admin, the diligence team said, we can consolidate executive admins, and they follow the ratios, so we get rid of 5 or 6 PAs, right? And 2 months after the deal closed, our customers called us and said, we didn't get the annual customer survey. And, we get so many of these things, we just want to make sure that we weren't missed. And they were upset. because they like to participate, and we usually got pretty good numbers. Well, it turned out one of the admins was doing the survey herself, wasn't on her job description, and it put us in a really defensive role. Had we known that, we wouldn't have let her go or would have had a plan around it. But that happens over and over again, where you're trying to be cost effective, get rid of every possible resource, and still hit the deal numbers. But going behind the job description and having these kind of conversations before it's too late is so critical. And that's a mistake that I've seen probably 3-4 times. And the last one is having someone like Jackie, a strategic HR person that understands the nuances, the culture, the org design, the higher level people issues, is really a huge differentiator, because we can all go in and do due diligence on T's and C's and benefits, but it's having someone with the leadership expertise to come in and really get a sense of what is the culture, what's the org, and have some intentional, sort of mapping over into the future.
Yeah, I'm sure we could go on and on and on about all our war stories, but for the sake of time, we'll have to move on. And I think we have a polling question coming up for Jackie, right?
You know what? This one is, can we go back to the last question? I have the second question. We showed 2 earlier, so it's really not this one. It's the results from the last polling question, please.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
Thank you. What % of executives rate the rigor with which they do cultural diligence on par or greater, hang on a second, with financial diligence? And you can see the results there. And the actual answer is 15%, which many of you got that right, which is good to see. So if you go forward, when David and I laid this out, this is such a complicated topic. We could talk about so many things. So we just picked some key areas. David did the intro. I'm not going to do this one for a while, not the next question.
Okay, sorry.
That's right. That's right. Thank you. So anyway, so this question, I don't think any of you are very surprised. You're so busy doing with the results of that poll question. You're doing the deal, you're just totally consumed with the financials, and there's so much dotting the I's, crossing the T's. You're so busy, you're negotiating, but it's really important. So one of the areas we wanted to talk about was talent mapping, and we've alluded to this a little bit before, and I think everyone knows what it is, but just in case, talent mapping is really making sure you're selecting and placing the right people in the right jobs. And this is really critical, and it ties to many of the things that David has mentioned so far. But in due diligence, sometimes it's secretive. You can't be surveying people ahead of time. You can't be doing anything, right? So I'm going to kind of talk about a continuum from when you've not got a lot of time and it's more secretive, or maybe you just don't have the resources to do it, a more robust situation, and then more of a high touch, or you're really able to invest some time in talent mapping. And in the low scenario, candidly, it's usually you're reading resumes, you have very limited access to other people, but you can usually get some talent lists of who they think are really important. You probably only do the top 2 tiers in the organization. It's very much acquirers culture dominant, if you will. It's really, this is how we operate and this is who we need. And then the focus is typically on pre-closing, right? Just to get things set up to get this integration off the ground. When you've got the opportunity, doing a much more thorough process really has significant benefits. So what does that look like, right? Sometimes if you can set up a talent selection office, that's really good, because you can have access, David already mentioned surveys, but on people, you can have access to more about them than their resume, right? It's perhaps their performance reviews, et cetera. And then we really encourage that you do a deep dive, multi-level talent to value calibration. And this can be phased, because the reality is, yeah, maybe you do most of it before. Phase 1 is before announcement. And then there should be several levels after as well, right? And some of the keys to this are, we mentioned earlier, but really getting appropriate leaders involved. David said earlier, defining the culture. I think this is one of the biggest mistakes. You don't really know what the culture is going to end up in, but I've been part of things where they said, I was on the other side, they said, we bought you for your talent and your culture. But then they didn't listen at all. There were no surveys or anything. And then it was very much a tops down. And then they're like, well, why didn't this work? Well, they didn't make sure they built it in. So spending that time and being open and transparent about it. But in thinking about talent mapping, it's really important. Because think of that, if David gave a couple examples, but the Amazon and Whole Foods example, if you're a tight college culture and you're really regimented, and you're a really loose culture, bottoms up, more like a Whole Foods, if you don't define that, you probably are not going to select the right people to run this new organization. That's a very big piece of it. One thing that's key to me on the tips and tricks thing is spend enough time on multi-incumbent roles. I never worked at Best Buy, but I think everyone knows Best Buy. And they have a group they call their blue shirts, right? When you go in the stores, you wait on the people who wait on you are the blue shirts, and they invest a lot in those people. So if you're only focused on that top 2 layers in the company, when you're doing the acquisition or merger and you forget about the blue shirts to make it visual for you, that is a big problem, because you got to make sure you don't walk some of the key talent, even by position, multi-level position, or excuse me, multi-incumbent position. You got to fight. If you're saying to everyone it's going to be a blend of the culture, you have to fight against cultural bias, and that you can't have every person in your new leadership team be from the dominant organization. And so you have to do a really good job of building that fair and transparent process from the early stages all the way through. You need to communicate that process to people once it's public so that they understand how decisions will be made about jobs. And then I think it's really important, David talked about surveys, but feedback loops, feedback loops throughout the old process, and showing your new employees and your current employees that you actually listen and make change, right? And sometimes no is an answer, but you can at least say then, we heard you, we can't do something about this particular situation. But it's worth investing the time and resources, because whatever you can get done up front and during the early year, if you will, 6 months to year of integration, significant long-term payoff. Because if you don't attract the hearts and minds of people up front, it's going to be very hard to get them to be engaged later.
Jackie, I've got a question for you. When it's what I would call an acquisition, where one party is, clearly the acquirer, the other party is, clearly the seller. But how about merger of equals? And this is interesting because, probably 20% of my career has been merger of equals. 80% I've been a strategic buyer. So I get that side of it. Merger of equals, I find much more difficult, because you could put together this talent committee to help sort through who stays, who doesn't. But at the end of the day, who really makes the call? It's like, you can't really have 2 CEOs, you can't 2 CFOs. Who's making the call?
Well, if you're talking at the CEO level, and David, you can jump in if you have a different experience. And in my experience, it's at the board level on the CEO. And then below it on the CEO, it's often for those top 2 levels, it's, the head of HR and whomever those key leaders, usually it's not a huge team, but they make consensus recommendations and there's a discussion. I found a good way to depersonalize it. It's not too different from selection outside of the process. I absolutely agree with you though. The merger and of equals is really tough, right? But you do a list, right, of what are the things that are most important? Like, we can't lose this certain skill set. Who are we going to make sure brings that to the party? This is the new culture. So as we've mentioned, but define that, because then if you've got equals, you can talk about, they're both equal in their skill level, as you're assuming. Then you can talk about some other attributes. Is this person, is being an inspirational leader really important in this role? Who's stronger at that? But you do several qualities, right? And then you can have more of a ranking system, and then you can actually talk about it. But I agree with you, it's harder.
Takes a little bit more of an effort, I think.
Yeah, it's pretty nuanced. And in my experience, Jay, they're typically, you know, in basketball where they have the arrow for jump balls. There's usually an arrow. It's not well spoken, but you count the number of board assignments and who is sitting on the board. That usually translates to, you know, the leadership team and who are getting those choice roles, you know, from the merged enterprise. And the last merger I went through, you know, it wasn't said, it was called, everyone wanted to think of it as two equals coming, but it really wasn't. And I think a lot of times there usually is some, a little bit more pull, but if you think about it, you really also need to think about the value that value creation and relative to what's the best possible organization to come out of this. And those first moves are so critical to flag to the organization who's really calling the shots. And if you know, to some extent, if it's truly, you know, 50-50 and it's battles, I'd rather have those battles in the first inning than the fifth inning. And things will shake out and it might not be real comfortable, but it's better to do it before you start going to market and your customers are getting frustrated and you're losing people. And so I would say that, and you really want to bulk up your retention strategy in that case, because you are going to lose people and you need to be thoughtful about who's absolutely necessary to pull through and keep. But you know, and I agree with Jackie that you know, it's having an objective process that's done by professionals where it's a third party or a really good HR leader is a good place to start. But you know, there's always bias. There's so much bias because you know people that you work with, and one of my frustrations has always been that the bias that you get for talent is so focused on the top talent. Most organizations miss the hidden value, you know, the value brokers in the organization that are further down, that have that unique relationship with the customer that no one really knows. And until, you know, either that person leaves or, you know, something happens, a lot of times you haven't done enough mapping to understand the value creators in the organization. And that's a huge, huge risk. And it happens in almost every deal that I've seen. And so if there's a way to bust through that. And one tool I've used is to have, you know, leaders, assuming you can tell leaders that, you know, this is happening and they're under NDA and have you get them to sponsor their top 2, 3, 4% of talent in their organization. Every leader at a certain level and above. So the CEO doesn't get more than anyone else, and you get 2%, and you begin to say, okay, here's our pool of top 2%ers, and then calibrate, and then have discussions as to, you know, because people get so focused on my function is the most important function, but calibrate that and then say, okay, let's now think about retention strategies that, you know, aren't just pay to play, but it's pay for performance. And you allow the retention approach to kind of really dictate their performance going forward. So, but yeah, it's clearly easier if you have a dominant player. If you don't, then, you know, you look at sort of the nuances behind the scene.
I guess I just throw one last catch-all in there. Any other lessons learned, positive, negative, from your experience around talent mapping, talent retention through an acquisition or merger?
Yeah, I'll go on a couple of them. On the talent mapping, have a contingency plan. I don't know if you guys have experienced this, but I've been part of things where we make up a name, Ann or Joe, and we are convinced they are the right person, and maybe it's whole departments and functions are geared off of getting that person, and we think all the conversations have gone well. We've put together a great package, including retention, and Ann or Joe walks. And we hadn't really thought about a contingency plan. And that you only need to get burned by that once to make sure you've thought about it more than that. On retention plans, I've had some that worked beautifully and others, you know, that weren't even necessary. You know, they kind of threw some money away. And so I think it's really important to, in your due diligence and in the cultural part of due diligence, to really assess who's needed, what's needed, is there really a retention risk or not?
Yeah, and I'll add, Jay, just on that last point, again, trying to avoid the bias that everyone at the top is the critical resource to keep. Because if you think about typically a retention budget is 2 to maybe 3%, 4%. And, you know, you really have to be judicious about that. And if you look at how you know, usually there's an equity component for the senior leaders that are going to tie them in irrespective. But if you look at what are people getting, if anything, as a result of this transaction, and most people don't get anything. They get a new boss, they get a new company shirt, and all of a sudden, you know, they're looking around thinking, okay, is this the place for me? So to Jackie's point, trying to figure out a way to bust through that, the bias on the top to get your true top talent, those hidden value creators, and then looking at, you know, not just performance, because usually that's rearview mirror, but really the go forward potential and what organization, what sort of skills do we need? Does this person meet that? And then, you know, the critical resource that there's no backup. And you know, companies do this fairly subjectively, but there is a methodology, there's a more quantifiable way to sort of at least get to a point of these are the folks that we should really think about. And then, and my own pet peeve on this is don't just pay to play. I mean, if they survive 6 months, so what? We want them to thrive. We want them to get something done. We want them to have objectives just like they do annually, so that we put in that retention program activities, you know, outcomes that need to happen. And one of the outcomes that's really missed in this is engagement and tying your leaders, particularly on, you know, the acquisition side, to some, you know, some sort of qualitative metric around, are your employees, did they come through this engaged? Did you do what you were supposed to do as a manager? Because that's the first person that they look at in terms of their Maslow's hierarchy. Okay, I've got a job, who do I report to? Is that person, you know, and so I think trying to figure out how do you get that level of leadership to have skin in the game, to really put the extra effort to get people from, you know, before all the way through the acquisition.
No, that's a great point. I think other, you know, industries, and I think of the regulated industries, banking and other industries, for example, where there's this long time period between, you know, announcement of the deal and closing in the regulatory process. That's where those stay bonuses really come into play. But David, to your point, I like the idea of putting some metrics to those stay bonuses as well. Not just stay, but, you know, what can you do while you're here?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
I think we have a polling question coming up, Jackie.
That's right. We can go to the one, Nancy, you were going to show. If you can go to that one. Thank you. Thank you. Acquired workers are twice as likely to leave the firm compared to regular hires with nearly identical profiles who are also hired into the same acquiring firm. True or false?
Folks, I'll give you just a few more seconds on that poll. I have 17 responses at this point. I'm waiting for 21. So if you're taking the polls, not you, Jay, I got you. All right, that's good. I'm going to end that poll and share those results. And everyone,
100%. Yay! Great job. Well, you guys know the answer, right? Here's, I want to talk about onboarding and assimilation, but in reference to that poll, you know, think about when you get hired into a new company, either a recruiter or someone's reached out to you, or you've applied for the job. And so there's this whole dance that typically goes on for weeks, if not months. You know, you get an opportunity as the employee to meet with the leaders, to meet with your direct boss, to understand the culture, to understand the mission and values, and to see if you want to work there or not, okay? And so it's not surprising, this poll question is not surprising, I think, to any of us, because when there's an acquisition or a merger, there's a select group of people who know what's going on, but most people, they might have heard some rumors, and often those rumors aren't good, right? So they're not coming to day one like, yay, and so maybe they are, sometimes they are, but often they're like, they like what they're doing. They like their company. They like their leadership. So then day one, it's like, boom. And all that dance back and forth of really getting to know the company doesn't happen, you know, doesn't happen. So what can you do about that? And I know we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to list some things, right? And it's really, really important to think about day one because that first impression every new employee has about this merger acquisition is really important. And yes, there's the whiffing factor, what's in it for me? They want to know their role. They want to know if there's going to be layoffs. They want to know their benefits and their comp, but you cannot stop there. Talked about hearts and minds earlier. It's really about, why would I want to work in this company? What's going to be good about this company? How are they going to be successful? Do I fit here? So think a lot about even how you communicate to the group. I think if many times, like someone just kind of gets thrown into a communications role, I'd really get your communications team, even if it's only 1 or 2 people, involved way up front as early as you can confidentially to start really working on messaging. So key is plan for it, plan for onboarding and assimilation. Then be very clear up front, what's the culture? As both of David and I mentioned earlier, is this, we use the loose tight term. Which kind of culture is it? Is it going to be more the acquirer's culture, or is it going to be a new culture? And how do we get to play in that? I love the phrase, communicate until you're blue in the face. You know, really put your, it's a good experience to be on the other side of the table, because that didn't happen to me for a long time. And then I was on the other side and we were acquired, and it was really interesting how you think differently, right? So try to have some empathy and think about what their questions will be. On the communication side, these might be obvious, but you verbally communicate so much. Where will that all that information be online? And try to train your new employees and your existing employees to go to that site for new information. Even if you push communications, still let them know there's a place they can go and there's a place they can send more questions. I think it's sometimes financially may not be feasible or not be feasible from a time perspective, but if you put together a good kind of maybe hour and a half first onboarding experience for the new people, have your existing employees go through that as well, because it puts you all on the same page. No one's wondering what was communicated, and we're all aligned on the new expectations. If you're familiar with it, there's a term, leader assimilation. Not every company does it. I'm a big fan. What it is in a nutshell is at all levels you can do this, but a leader has a facilitated session, doesn't have to be longer than like an hour. And it's usually on the same day, because you don't want to have the leader go off and prepare canned remarks. But the employees meet, and a facilitator, an in-house person, usually from HR, you know, ask them, what are your questions? I'll use Jay. What are your questions about Jay? And it's usually becomes everything from what do you like to do on the weekend to how do you like to be communicated with via text, email, or a phone call, you know, voicemail, which nobody really uses anymore. But, you know, you put that out there to, hey, I want to know what your pet peeves are. Like, and what's your mission for this job? Why did you take this job? Why are you still with the company? And it can really jumpstart that trust, because what we're really talking about here for successful integration is building trust, right? And it can really jumpstart so that people are sitting there going, you know what? Yeah, I could see myself working here. I think I want to stay here. This could be good for me. We've talked a little about surveys. I think people wait too long. It's tough, as David said, to get some of that information pre-closing. But if you can do even a pulse survey early after it's the acquisition or merger has been announced, you can respond. And that is a great way to build those relationships, that while they actually listened and they did something about whatever the theme issues are. And then I've mentioned adjust and respond. You know, you've got those feedback loops throughout. And one thing I don't think we've talked about yet is recognition. Sometimes you're so busy in that first 6 months or year, you forget to say thank you to people. And so I'm talking about both informal and formal recognition. Most big companies have some kind of online or even paper for warehouse call center type employees, ways to peer recognize each other. There's a way to either, you know, you can make those visible either through in monthly meetings announcing them or putting something up literally on a wall. If you've got, as I said, a DC distribution center, call center kind of facility, but also recognize people for results, in some kind of, maybe a company, it doesn't have to be a big party, right? But hey, we're 3 months in and here are some people who have done some great things in an e-newsletter. Or one place I worked, they did like a 3-minute call from the a 3-minute recorded little video from the CEO every week. Here's what's going on. Here's what's not working so well. Gosh, I want to recognize these people. So do it within the culture of your organization, but recognition can be very powerful during onboarding and assimilation.
Those are good points. I think recognition, and David mentioned swag, all of these little things, but it has to be genuine. It has to be real, authentic. Otherwise, I think it works in the other way for you. People, it builds distrust if they see through it, I guess is the point.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because it will backfire terribly. It can't just be, hey, take your new shirt. Well, I don't want to work here anyway. I don't want to wear that shirt.
Yeah, Jay, I think the most successful programs I've seen in terms of this process is being very thoughtful about the people that don't have a job. This last deal I worked on, we had a private LinkedIn site set up for people that were displaced because the deal, required synergies. A couple hundred people unfortunately lost their job, and everyone in both companies joined a private LinkedIn site to say, our goal is to put to work through our collective networks 25% of those that are displaced. And we were able to do that. And it was probably one of the best cultural moves we could have done, because people realized we're not going to just move on, and we care about people and we want them to find a home. And so, it's the other thing I'd throw in there is we literally set up every individual in that company with a navigation coach, a buddy in the other company. And so not in their chain of command, where they had someone to talk to, say, what's the deal about this, and have real honest conversations. And that was enormously successful to get, again, the trust level up and to get some collegiality going. But there's a lot of good ideas, but I think it goes back to what Jackie says, trust, empathy, put yourself in the shoes of the person that's coming over, and what could you do to make that a better experience? And then how do you begin to make sure there's early smoke signals if people are in the ditch, and trying to get them back in line?
That's a great example of, coming together and rallying for the people that are on the out, so to speak. And we all have networks, everybody can help, and I'm going to remember that one for down the road here. I think we're up to a polling question again.
Thank you, Jay.
What % of senior executives involved in attempted combinations reported they felt unprepared to deal with the culture? Oh, that's a good one.
Okay, folks, that poll is up on your screen. I'll give you a few more seconds to answer that question.
David, I'm going to let you decipher this one.
All right. We've been leading the witness in a lot of these questions, but that's okay. So this is
I'm going to end that poll and share those results. Sorry for interrupting.
No, that's great.
There you go.
There you go. Yep. So vast majority, 40% said 80%, and surprisingly, notwithstanding all of the recognition on culture, the deal teams are typically led by corporate development or outside consultants, and they've been trained to look at financials, trained to look at the market, all the things that they're wonderful at. But it's not always intuitive to bring in HR, bring in a cultural component to it. So we now know on this call the importance of that, but it's equally sort of not important, but something to keep in mind is how to measure all this stuff. It's very soft. What kind of metrics can we put in place to really get a sense of, have we done a good job? Could we do a better job? And any consultant, anyone that does this for a while has a library of metrics, right? Around customer, around pipeline, around, the financials. And you can Google and get a great list of those, but there aren't a lot of really good metrics around people, engagement, culture. And so just some food for thought. One is productivity, basic productivity, to get a sense of, what is your revenue or EBITDA per employee, both companies before, during, after, just to get a sense of what does that look like and why is there, if there is a difference, and that will come up in the due diligence process. But one that doesn't come up very often that I like is revenue or EBITDA per HR dollar spent. So if you threw all the HR programs, your benefits, your HR function into a bucket, and you looked at the ratio between your EBITDA or revenue or profitability per HR dollar, it gives you a sense of just the amount of people expense you have in your organization. That's not limited to acquisitions, but it's another way to kind of look at how are we investing in our people vis-a-vis other companies. On turnover, a lot of people look at the high level turnover, whatever it is, and they stop. You really have to look at the trends within turnover and look at it demographically, look at it performance-wise, look at it from a tenure perspective to see where are people, sort of, we get them past 2 years and they tend to stay, and is that different in different groups, and really probe that. But in an acquisition, a couple things to think about. Productivity is huge. We're doing a lot of this so that we get people productive and excited about the future. So 30 days, no sooner, 30 days after they start, you should ask them, do a survey and basically say, are you as productive as you were before, the acquisition? The intent to stay, in my experience, the question that's the most correlative to actual reality is, do you intend to stay in the company? And surprisingly, people are really honest about that. So if you ask people 30 days in, do you intend to stay at this company? Because they've had a month to really let the dust settle, get a sense of what their job is. Do you intend to stay for 12 months? You will get a highly predictive measure of whether they're going to stay. And you can actually begin to intervene if it looks like you have challenges. The other one is just around understanding their role. Again, that's one of the biggest problems you see is people don't truly understand what their role is. And the sooner you can get them to understand the role, the more productive, the more engaged they'll be. And the last thing is an NPS score. So if you do a lot of deals, it's nice to have a consistent way to ask a question of your employees. Are you a promoter? Are you a detractor of the transition or the acquisition process? Just kind of high level. And to give you a sense of how good did we do organizationally getting people, to be promoters. And don't expect you're going to get, plus 40, plus 50, 60, because most people in acquisitions go in with a great degree of distrust. And they're almost looking for reasons not to appreciate this transaction. So you got to really do a lot of work just to get even to zero, much less a positive NPS. But again, if you do a lot of deals, it's a really nice way to say, how does this compare? And then you can correlate that to your financial success. But those would be some metrics that I would think about in terms of your successful transitions.
I find it interesting. It's always those softer skill metrics that are difficult to come up with, right? It's, all of us are financial people. We get the numbers, but, what about the hearts and the minds of people working within the organization?
Exactly.
I guess I'm going to switch gears a little bit, maybe put both of you on the spot. And we've been in a pandemic, yet M&A activity, one could say, is almost at an all-time high. It's, certainly there's people on this call that knows it better than I do. I know Joe Hellman's on, Joe Hausman, people that work in deals all day long. But let's say we're coming out of the pandemic. What has the pandemic done from the perspective of changing due diligence and the way we go about due diligence? And, I'm asking you to be a futurist here and say, how do we change now going forward?
Okay, maybe I'll start. Let's remember, I am an HR person, but I think this is backed up by everything we've been talking about today. I think the pandemic and any job that could work from home, working from home for the last year has really changed our workforce probably the most dramatically of anything in my career. And I've been working over 30 years, right? And so I think when you're doing mergers and acquisitions, there's going to be a personalization element. And you need to actually recruit people to stay in the new organization. And so the importance of culture and integration, I think, is just going to go sky high. And I think it's not a matter of, don't hear me saying you have to do whatever they want, every individual wants. That's not it. But I think it makes it critical that you're very clear about the culture and who you want to be, and that you talked about authenticity earlier, and I think that's really important, then your policies, your communication, everything you're saying you want to be, you're backing that up. And then you are being transparent with people so they can self-select in or self-select out. And just listening to David's comment and thinking about it as we've been talking about this morning, I think the whole piece about how you treat people who aren't going to work there, there is enormous, sadly, I've done a lot of reductions in force in my career. And other than the recession, like 2008, 2009, I was working for a company when the pandemic hit. And I'm on a network of HR executives with like 80 plus execs in the Twin Cities. And companies didn't have the time, didn't have the dollars, weren't always able to treat their employees the way they had historically. It was very hard on organizations. And I think this kind of working from home, getting focused on your home, your family, what's important to you, there's going to be even more focus on during this acquisition or merger, how are they treating people? Not only those who are going to stay, but those who go.
So being a lawyer and an HR person, I have kind of two polar opposite responses to that. I agree with everything Jackie just said. I have no doubt that the world is moving toward an environment where choice and hybrid models are going to be the reality, right? There's an article today that said Goldman Sachs and some of the PE firms are going back to traditional in-office jobs, and that's a decision that they're trying to differentiate in terms of who they are. But there's a spectrum that is much more weighted towards flexibility to remote working. I think that's inevitable. That's a macro trend that's not going to come back significantly. The millennial movement, in terms of just the ability to move, job hop, and expect to be treated wonderfully no matter where you are, it's the majority of our workers. So that's a reality. Unemployment is still low, and for high skilled workers, it's almost zero. That's a war on talent and a supply demand model that probably isn't going to change, hopefully, for a while. So that's another reality. But I think if you look at all that and you'd say, well, if I really looked at companies that focus on people, focus on culture, focus on the new reality of the workplace, I tend to think that they're going to be able to produce and provide and demonstrate an alpha over their competitors, because their talent set is broader. Their ability to, really mix and match to create value is going to be stronger. And I think as that becomes, out of sort of the do good and what feels right to, it's a business imperative. Culture is a strategy. It's not just an outcome. It's actually a strategy. And if you look at companies, like 3M, Amazon, the list goes on of companies that really consider it a strategy, they tend to outperform. And I don't think that's gonna change. In the ancillary, companies that are unhealthy, there's a big bank that had a very unhealthy culture, and look what happened. And so I tend to think that, and every industry is gonna be a little bit different, obviously, but the macro trends would suggest this is not gonna change. The focus on companies are more naked than they've ever been. You can figure out company culture easier than ever before. 90% of millennial candidates look at Glassdoor before they interview with the company. Think about that, 90%. So if you want to get a millennial, you better have a pretty good story, and you better at least pay attention to Glassdoor. So for all those reasons, I tend to think that, it is, and those that want to thrive versus survive really have to lean in on this, whether it's through acquisition or just ordinary course of business, really be thoughtful about, okay, we're here, we need to get here. And I think it's going to result in better business outcomes. So.
Well, thank you. I'm looking at the chat area, just making sure we get any questions covered. I haven't seen one, and I know we're down to the last 3 minutes, but it's been a good interactive conversation. I do think we're all going to be facing the remote worker situation. And when I say remote, they may be in Florida, Arizona. They are not in the backyard at home. So this is going to stress I think stress management teams on the culture and keeping people together. Not only that, in one way, it's not as expensive, but I can also tell you, if you're rallying your teams together for in-person events, don't forget that cost adds up too. We're facing it. So go ahead, Jackie.
I was just going to add on, it's culture related, but you know, it's not like we haven't done remote work before. And one of the things you lose though is a lot of innovation and kind of trust building, because you don't have that, everything's scheduled. You don't have that like just drop in your office and let's have a conversation and wow, a good idea comes up. It just felt like a good time to throw that in.
Awesome. Well, I think we're running up against the time here, and we have a polling question.
Can we respond to that too?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's a polling question, folks. We do appreciate your patience. If you need more information, please, or if this session met your expectations, please hit yes or no. We do appreciate your feedback.
And if anybody has any follow-up questions, feel free to email me, or we'll make sure to get some answers back from David and Jackie in their firm.
Yeah, and
Let's say-
if you have, we have a lot of freebie, things we can help you with. If you're doing your own deal and you just want to get a checklist or template or something, just let us know. We'd be glad to help.
Thank you. Thank you. I believe that's our signal. We are out of time. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And again, folks, CPE will be available in 7 to 10 business days. Thank you for your patience, and we wish you the best of the afternoon. This does end the webinar. Have a great day.